Visuals on your screens from Chandigarh, protests by the Congress workers. They're getting intense at this point in time, and you can see those visuals there. The police and the protesters clashing, barricades being put up there. One of the cops is on the barricades as well, trying to control the protesters. But of course, the situation quite tense at the moment, and you can see what's happening there on your screens. Remember, these protests have been going on since this morning with regard to Sonia Gandhi's questioning in the National Herald case by the ED, and water cannons also being used right now by the cops to try and bring these protests under control. Of course, those are the live visuals coming to you on your screens from Chandigarh, where the protests are going on at this point in time, becoming quite intense. Remember, protests being carried out in multiple cities across the country. It's a countrywide protest as far as the Congress is concerned over the questioning of Sonia Gandhi by the Enforcement Directorate. But remember, that questioning has now ended. She has been summoned once again on Monday. But these protests here continuing across various parts of the country, and live visuals on your screens of those protests which are getting intense in Chandigarh at this point in time. The police has barricaded that entire section to ensure that the protesters don't get ahead of the barricade, and are trying to control the situation at this point in time. Remember, we've seen protests break out in the national capital as well. Outside the Enforcement Directorate, there were protests being held outside the AICC headquarters as well. We've seen protests that have been held. We saw several Congress leaders and MPs who were detained by the police in Delhi as well. But these are protests that are going on in Chandigarh here that we are showing you visuals of on your screens at this point in time. Remember, this is the National Herald case, and earlier as well, Rahul Gandhi was questioned in the same case multiple times, is what he was called by the Enforcement Directorate. Then too, there were protests that broke out, and now, of course, Sonia Gandhi is being summoned and being questioned. In fact, her question was postponed since she had COVID, and she was questioned for about 2 hours today after she put in a request saying that she was still recovering from COVID, and which is why she was let off early after 2 hours, and now has been summoned once again on Monday. But those are live visuals coming to you on your screens at this point in time of what's really happening in Chandigarh, where the protesters and the police are facing off with each other at this point in time. A massive crowd there of protesters, and in security also extremely high. The police deployment is quite high. Sloganeering also going on at this point in time. Cops are having to use water cannons to try and control the crowd and send them back. Some of the protesters now turning away is what we are seeing and going in the other direction. But the clash continues there at this point in time. If you've just tuned in, visuals there on your screens of Chandigarh, what's happening, the massive protests going on in Chandigarh. There is massive sloganeering, cops having to use water cannons. Remember, this is all big protests going on across the country in several cities against Sonia Gandhi's questioning by the Enforcement Directorate in the alleged money laundering in the National Herald case, which is going on. In this case, even Rahul Gandhi was questioned earlier. Today, both Rahul and Priyanka Gandhi accompanied Sonia Gandhi to the Enforcement Directorate office. Protests in multiple cities in the national capital at several locations as well. In fact, you can see those visuals on your screens. We're also going to try and get our reporter to try and figure out what exactly is happening, whether there is any kind of talks going on between the cops and the protesters, whether there was permission for this particular protest as well. So those questions at this point in time are still awaiting answers for, but the Sonia Gandhi being summoned once again on Monday as well. So that is the latest that we are getting you with regard to this entire situation. But let's also listen into some reactions here coming in, and we'll keep those visuals of what's happening in Chandigarh on the screens as well.
Enforcement Directorate एक एजेंसी है जो जांच करती है भ्रष्टाचार के खिलाफ, मनी लॉन्ड्रिंग, उसको इमीडिएट कहना है एजेंसी को, कैसे देखें आप इसे?
कांग्रेस पार्टी के नेता अगर एक स्वतंत्र जांच एजेंसी को दिखा सकता है, इसको अगर ईडी को, इन्फोर्समेंट डायरेक्टरेट को अगर इडियट कह रहे थे तो आप समझ सकते हैं कि किस तरह से मानसिक रूप से वो दिवालिया हो चुके हैं। फिर आज अगर एसोसिएटेड जर्नल लिमिटेड के मामले में ईडी पूछताछ कर रही तो इस पर दबाव बनाने की क्या जरूरत है?
मैं वही आखिरी सवाल आपसे पूछना चाहता हूँ कि इस वक्त जो है सदन की कार्रवाई और अपोजिशन ये दिखा रहा था कि वो सोनिया गांधी के साथ है, लेकिन टीएमसी भी उनके सपोर्ट में खड़ी नहीं हुई। सदन की कार्रवाई चल रही है, तो ये क्या अपोजिशन की एकता जो है वो कांग्रेस पार्टी के साथ यूनाइट नहीं है?
देखिए, ये ईडी के मामले में के साथ तो क्यों खड़ा होगा कि जो भ्रष्टाचार में ऑलरेडी चीज़ें जिसकी संलिप्तता हो, इन्वॉल्वमेंट हो, तो कोई पार्टी तो भ्रष्टाचार को बचाने के लिए अपने साथ क्यों खड़ी होगी? सवाल तो महंगाई की जहाँ तक बात है, 3 दिन से सदन नहीं चलने दे रहे, महंगाई पर चर्चा चाहते हैं।
The government has tried to target Mrs. Gandhi and Rahul ji, and the blatant misuse of these agencies is something that is going to be very dangerous for our country, for our democracy, and in the time to come, people will realize this blatant abuse of authority, this blatant misuse of CBI and ED, income tax, etc., is something that's uncalled for. And इस केस में तो कोई एफआईआर नहीं है, कोई केस नहीं है, जानबूझ के पॉलिटिकल ओपोनेंट्स को दबाने की कोशिश की जा रही है, and we will face it politically, we'll face it whatever they want to do, but the entire country is watching how the government of India is absolutely hell-bent upon muzzling the voice of the Congress party and its leadership, and we are fully prepared to take on any challenge.
Voices of the opposition, we will fight against this.
All right, well, those are some reactions coming in from earlier today, but the visuals that we are showing you on your screens is of what's happening in Chandigarh at the moment, where the protests are going on. The protests have got intensive, and you can see on the right side of your screens water cannons being used as well. The police are trying to bring the protesters under control, but the situation seems to have gotten out of hand. Water cannons being used, in fact, in a vigorous manner at the protesters, but that's not seeming to deter the protesters at this point in time. Remember, this is entirely over Sonia Gandhi's questioning by the Enforcement Directorate. Congress has been alleging that the central agencies are being misused. In fact, there was a big opposition meeting as well today in Parliament on that specific issue. We've seen incidents of arson as well, in sporadic incidents of arson that have happened in some parts of the country. And of course, the situation in Chandigarh right now is extremely tense at this point in time. Water cannons being used to try and bring the protesters in control, and huge barricades set up as well. Protesters trying to sort of scale those barricades, police trying to sort of keep them under control. But that is what's happening in Chandigarh on the right sides of your screens, and on the left side of your screen you can see